Welcome to Wine, Whiskey, and Song, where we explore the connections we make with wine, with whiskey, and with music. Here's Andy Wesley and Tom Roper. Welcome back to Wine, Whiskey, and Song. Today we're going to talk about tasting, specifically wine tasting, and tasting wine the way that you listen to music. And so first we're going to go through the mechanics of how to taste correctly, and then we'll talk a little bit about particular characteristics of wine that can be matched to music in a particular way. So we're going to be using a bottle of 2020 Louis Jadot Beaujolais-Village. You can find this at just about any grocery store or fine wine shop, or even most liquor stores would have it. And so let's get started with a little bit of tasting. Now, when you taste, the important thing to remember is that we always want to taste in the same order. First, we're going to look at the wine, then we're going to smell the wine, then we're going to taste the wine. And there are particular components that you look for when you're tasting a wine for quality and to assess the wine in sort of a scientific way. Now, keep in mind that drinking wine and tasting wine are two different things. But one of the things that we're trying to do is just make a connection between how you taste and how you listen to music. We're going to use the WSET systematic approach to tasting. If you're interested in learning more about the systematic approach to tasting, you can actually go to wsetglobal.com and search systematic approach to tasting and get a sheet that looks like this, which will walk you through each of the things that you do when you taste. We're not going to talk about all of them today, but we're going to make some connections to tasting and music. So some of you have probably noticed wine people will swirl the wine like this a little bit in the glass. That's just to volatilize some of the aromas and make it easier for them to get to your mouth. As I mentioned, we're going to look at the wine, and I always try to look with the red wine. You want to look at sort of the edge of the edge of the color, and then also look down through the wine to the stem of the glass, because one of the things that we're looking for here is the intensity of the color, or the depth of the color. Next, we're going to smell the wine. And I usually like to smell with both nostrils, because I find that I notice different things between different nostrils. And then we'll taste the wine. You heard that I was pulling air through the liquid. The reason for that is because you want to move the wine around to every part of your mouth, because different parts of your mouth or palate will taste both different flavors and also be able to feel different things that we want to focus on in terms of the wine. Some of those things that we're looking at are acidity and tannin and body and length, and all of these things are things that you feel rather than necessarily tasting.
Okay.
So a lot of people can identify different flavors in a wine, which is important. But when we look to identify the quality of the wine, we're looking for particular factors that help balance the wine out. The first of which, as I mentioned, is acidity. Now, when you taste acidity in a wine, acidity will cause your mouth to start watering. So for those of you who are having trouble picturing what acidity is, cut a lemon in quarters and stick the lemon in your mouth, and what you're feeling is acidity. Now, from a musical perspective, I like to think about acidity being similar to treble in a song. Acidity are higher tones. Treble are the higher notes in a song, and you feel them differently than you feel bass. I would say bass is similar to the body in a wine. The thickness or the weight of the wine is sort of that thump that you find in bass.
Yeah, like the so like in music, you've got like the higher frequencies give the song a brightness. Would you use the same to describe a wine's acidity? Like
yeah.
It's a brighter wine.
Yeah, and the purpose of acidity, to give you a little like winemaking chemistry, acidity will work inversely to the amount of sugar in a grape when it is picked. So in cooler climates, we tend to get wines that have higher acidity and less sugar, less alcohol, once the wines are fermented. In warmer climates, you tend to get wines that are have more alcohol but less acidity. And the important thing about acidity is what will help a white wine age. And acidity is what will help both white wines and red wines. Acidity is what sort of carries the fruit across the palate. So you need those high tones, that saliva in your mouth, to allow the wine to move all the way across your palate and finish correctly. So that's acidity. We talked about acidity. We talked about base being similar to the body in a wine. Another thing that is very important to identify in a wine is the wine's intensity. I tend to think of the intensity of a wine similar to the way that you would think of volume on your stereo. So while wines that are louder or more, have more clarity to them, tend to have more acidity. So we've got acidity, we've got which is similar to treble. We've got body, which is similar to base. We've got intensity, which is similar to volume. And then with red wines, you've probably heard some discussion about tannin. Tannin is a natural preservative in the skin of red grapes, which is what allows a red grape to age. And when you taste tannin is the thing that dries your mouth out and sort of gives a powdery, sort of rough feeling on your palate. So you can sort of think about tannin like distortion in a song. That little bit of roughness, that little bit of, grind that you get in certain songs is similar to the way that tannin feels on your palate. So let's talk a little bit about, once we've identified the acidity level and the tannin level in a red wine. White wines don't have tannin normally. The reason being that tannin is, as I mentioned, in the skins of a grape. And if you remember back when we talked about white winemaking, with white wines, we remove the skins almost immediately. So skins do not remain in contact with white grape juice when we ferment it. So the tannin is really something that we talk about with red wines rather than white wines. So we've got a certain amount of acidity, a certain amount of tannin, a certain amount of body, and a certain amount of intensity that are going to help us identify different components of the wine, along with fruit flavors. Like if we taste this Beaujolais-Village, I get a lot of raspberry on the palate, and there's a sort of a white pepper sensation. There's also some other fruits that you wouldn't necessarily normally associate with red wine, like you get a little banana. Banana is actually comes from carbonic maceration, which is a particular process that Beaujolais goes through. The reason why all of these things are important is because we are going to try to subjectively and objectively identify the quality of a wine. Subjectively is how much you like the wine. And the rule is, if you like something, drink it. If you don't like it, don't drink it. That's the most important thing. But if objectively we want to identify the quality of a wine, we're going to identify the quality of that wine based on 4 things: balance, length, intensity, and complexity. Blick. Balance, length, intensity, complexity. So let's talk about what's balance. Balance, again, to have a musical reference point, balance is everything in its proper place and nothing sticking out too much. So if you listen to your car stereo and you're hearing the right side of the car more than the left side of the car, your speakers are out of balance. And you can adjust that in your car stereo. basically, it either exists in a wine or doesn't exist in a wine. Now, I can tell you a vast majority of the wines on the market these days are made in balance. There are very few things that are out of balance. So we're usually going to give a wine credit for balance. Length, Tom and I were talking about this before we started filming today. Length in a wine is the flavors of the wine, the pleasant flavors of the wine continuing on your palate even after the wine's gone. That sort of ring in your ears when a great song ends. Tom talked about the tail of a song sort of going on forever. You have, songs that after they're over, they just continue to ring in your ears. A great wine you continue to taste long after you've either spit it out in a tasting environment or you've swallowed it, because the acidity in that wine is carrying that wine and sitting it on the back of your palate and leaving those flavors there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Intensity, as we talked about, is volume or clarity. Better wines have more volume or more clarity in terms of how the fruit expresses itself on your palate. And then complexity. Complexity is both breadth of flavor and depth of flavor. So a Rush song has a lot of complexity,
yes,
right? There's a lot of things going on. And all of those things are adding something to that particular song. Now, there's great music that has very little complexity. I like to think of the Ramones, right? The Ramones are just, three chords and the truth, right? Just that pop over and over again. There's not a lot of complexity there, but if the other components, the balance, the length, and the intensity are there enough, it can sometimes make up for complexity.
Totally makes sense in the case of like Ramones. I mean, a Ramones song's going to be ringing in your ears forever. Length after it's over.
Ton of length, ton of intensity, right?
Intensity?
Ton of volume, ton of clarity to it.
There.
Do the Ramones have balance? I don't know. I don't care, right? The
if you like it, listen to it.
If you like it, listen to it.
If you like it, drink it.
Absolutely. And the other thing that's important to realize here is that I would contend that wine is part art and part science. Can you give that to me? The wine is part art and part science.
Yeah.
And I would also contend that in order for anything artistic to be truly great, it's got to be offensive to somebody, right? Somebody's got to not like it. Somebody's got to not like a song or a piece of art in order for it to be great. Mm-hmm. When I do tasting events, a lot of times I'll ask people, how many of you really, really like Metallica? And certain people will raise their hand. And then I'll say, okay, great. How many of you really, really hate Metallica? And certain people will raise their hand. And the thing that's interesting about music and about wine, because part of it is artistic, is that the same things that make the people who love Metallica are also the things that people who hate Metallica hate about Metallica. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing. It's the commitment to that level of understanding or their chord progression or their rhythm or whatever it is that puts that song at a level of commitment that's going to be interesting to some people and not interesting to other people. Mm-hmm. The last thing I wanted to mention about tasting is something that I actually heard referenced to Tim Gazer, who's a master sommelier who recently wrote a book called Message in a Bottle. That will become important later. Mm-hmm. But Tim's book, Message in a Bottle, Tim talks about wine tasting being sort of a shared hallucination. What do we mean by that? When you smell a wine, when you taste a wine, what's actually happening is your taste buds and your nasal receptors are picking up a bunch of different messages all at once and sending them to your brain, and your brain is basically creating a hallucination of what that wine tastes like, what that wine feels like on your palate, how much you're enjoying the wine. Now, the reason why it's shared is because we can get to the point that the picture that all of us are creating in our heads is relatively close by using common language. also heard somebody talk about the way that you take something from a subjective understanding to a objective understanding is you add common language, which is why we use acidity. We use terms like low acidity, medium acidity, high acidity. I say things like, I taste raspberry and white pepper. The interesting thing about that idea of a shared hallucination is, I'm not sure if this has ever happened to you, but if both of us are smelling this wine and I say, Tom, I smell raspberries, Tom might be more likely to go, oh yeah, I smell raspberries too, right? Because now we're sharing that hallucination. My brain is sharing a message with your brain, and your brain is then more likely to ask your nasal receptors, well, are you getting raspberry too? Sometimes there's a lot of agreement there and sometimes there isn't. But I think it's really interesting to think about that idea of shared hallucination in terms of tasting. So just a real quick review. First of all, anytime you taste a wine, look at the wine, smell the wine, and then taste the wine. And you're going to pick up different indicators from each of those things. Now, science says that your nose is a better indicator of evaluating a wine than your palate is. Why? Because every time you taste a wine, you actually smell it twice. Right? I'm smelling it initially when I smell here, and then when I taste the wine is volatilizing and going up the back of my throat to those nasal receptors again. That sort of retronasal understanding of the wine. So if you do that repetitively, you have homework, Tom. Go home and taste a lot of different wines and do it in that format. Think about acidity in terms of the treble in a song. Think about body in terms of the bass of the song. Think about intensity in terms of volume, and then that idea of tannin creating a little bit of distortion in your mouth with red wines. Now that tannin will soften over time because it's a natural preservative that's creating that sensation, which will soften over time.
And that's what you age a wine, and it gets a little bit softer, a little less distortion.
Yep, a little bit less distortion, creating a little bit more clarity, perhaps, in the fruit or the spice in that particular wine. Last thing to mention really quickly is food and wine pairing. A lot of times people have questions about what are the rules for food and wine pairing. From my perspective, the rules are there ain't no rules. Drink whatever you want, with whatever you want, whenever you want. Drink Grand Cru Burgundy with Italian beef sandwiches from Chicago. I do, because I like both of those things, and I like the combinations that they create. But there are some suggestions. You've probably heard white wine with fish, red wine with meat. Now, there's a scientific reason why those things are true, and it has to do with some of the stuff that we've talked about already. White wines, good white wines, are high in acidity. And because they are high in acidity, they go well with fish because fish flesh is made up of a lot of oil. There's a lot of fat and a lot of oil in fish flesh. What would you put on fish if you didn't have good red wine? You'd sprinkle lemon across the top of it, which is high in acidity. The acidity in the wine cuts through the oil in the fish. Red wines, particularly red wines from Cabernet Sauvignon and other Bordeaux varietals, tend to be high in tannin. Tannin bonds with protein in red meat to help you digest it. I'll give you another example of that relationship. Some of you probably drink coffee. I know I do. What do you put in coffee, which is high in tannin, to soften your coffee?
Half and half.
Cream, right? Cream is high in protein.
Absolutely.
The protein in the cream bonds with the tannin in the coffee to create a better digestive experience and a better tasting experience. Down the road with Wine, Whiskey, and Song, we're going to start talking about pairing wine with music and particular styles of wine and how they go with with particular songs and particular genres of music. But for today, we'll leave it here talking about tasting wine, similar to the way that you listen to music, and also a little bit about food and wine pairing. Tom, what thoughts do you have about anything that we've talked about or about the wine here?
Well, interesting. I just on the tasting notes on this particular wine, I'm getting something similar to what I get in a lot of Sauvignon Blancs, which is a little grapefruit and a little melon.
There's a lot, and that's
Which I would not expect from a red, but that's
absolutely. And what you're actually tasting here is a wine that is very high in acidity. Grapefruit and melon are high in acidity, so you're feeling those sensations and equating them to those two fruit flavors.
Wow.
So there's also some real, and you talked earlier about treble being the brightness in a song. There's a real brightness about this wine.
Yes.
It's very, very high in acidity. It doesn't have a lot of base. Even though it's a red wine, it doesn't have a lot of tannin. The winemaking, first of all, this grape, this wine is made with a grape called Gamay, which tends to be thin-skinned and therefore lower in tannin. And then the winemaking process is such that they soften the any tannin that might be there as part of the winemaking process. So we could describe this wine as being basically all treble, no base, no distortion, right? Real clean fruit flavors and
clarity.
Yeah, lots of clarity and lots of spice to it.
Yeah.
And that's our discussion of tasting wine like you listen to music.
And an important point you made earlier about if you like it, drink it. It's like music. If you like it, listen to it. If you don't like it, well, don't. It's back in when I was younger and I, starting to get into I think higher, at least what you would perceive as quality levels of wine. I would call myself a wine snob, and I would actually say that wine, that cheap wine, that sucks. It's terrible. Don't drink that. Wrong. If you like it, drink it.
Sure.
If you find, if you love 3 Buck Chuck and that's your favorite wine and you get your foods you love to drink it with, if you're saving a lot of money, go for it. You enjoy the experience.
Sure. And there's another musical concept that kind of comes in here, which is the guilty pleasure. Right?
Yes.
Drinking this wine is like listening to, the Partridge Family or
the Breakin' soundtrack.
Yeah, the Breakin' soundtrack.
Yes.
Or I'm actually a huge ABBA fan. I love me some ABBA.
Oh, hey.
And
awesome.
the ABBA does ABBA have balance? Yes. Does ABBA have length? Yes. Does ABBA have intensity? Yes. Does ABBA have complexity? Absolutely. But it's also sort of a bright, trebly, guilty pleasure. And that would be one way that I might describe this wine. It's bright, it's fruity, it's easy to drink. The wines that people consider to be the great wines of the world. If you were to take the Wine Spectator does a list of the 100 best wines from each year.
Yes.
And we can spend an entire show talking about what sense it makes to compare wines to each other or wine grading and all of that different stuff. But most of those wines, most of the public would not enjoy because they are made to a commitment level that is not going to be to everybody's liking. Wines that we would consider guilty pleasure wines that are simpler and easier to drink like this are probably going to be more interesting and more pleasurable to more people because in the same way that, some people don't like to sit down and just listen to Rush because it's work, right? You have to pay attention to everything. You have to, ABBA's a lot easier to just, just like sit and listen to and enjoy. And I think there's something to that fact as well, that the right wine for a particular circumstance might not be the most complex, most, intense wine with an awful lot of length, because sometimes you just want to sit on your back patio and listen to ABBA.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Cheers.
We'll see y'all again.
That is nice.
Yeah, yummy.
Yeah.
So for our song this episode, we chose partially in homage to Tim Gazer's book and partially just because I think it fits really well with the idea of dissecting a wine and identifying the message in a bottle, is the Police song of the same name. And one of the things I thought was interesting as I was reading about this song a little bit, which I did not realize before this, when the Police were formed, Sting had a book of lyrics already. And a lot of the songs from later albums, the lyrics had already been written. And this song was actually the first single off their second album. Mm-hmm. And they were really worried about that sophomore slump that people talk about. They had had a couple of hits off their first album, and Message in a Bottle was the first single off the second album. This song was released in 1979, which means it's coming up on 50 years old, which I think is pretty incredible. And the lasting power of this particular song and the message in it.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah. It's just impressive when a song just kind of stays in that, at the forefront of the general public's consciousness. You can get out, you can play this song in an open mic or stage gig or something, and everyone's like, yeah.
Sure. And this is also one of those songs that we talked about with one of our intro episodes about this idea that you can hear a song on the radio and it will take you back to a particular moment in time.
Yeah.
And you remember everything you thought about and everything you were feeling at that particular time. And this is one of those songs for me that, every time it comes on the radio, it takes me back to my youth, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. It takes me back to like the early times when I've played this song in other bands and stuff. And it's like, yeah, it's just fun to play. And I think we've got kind of a unique take on it as well.
Sure.
A few changes from the original that I think sound really really cool, really interesting, and it's fun to play.
Cool. This is Message in a Bottle.
Just a castaway, an island lost at sea. Oh, another lonely day, no one here but me. Oh, more loneliness any man could bear. Rescue me before I fall into despair. Oh, I'll send an SOS to the world. I'll send an SOS to the world. I hope that someone gets mine. I hope that someone gets mine. I hope that someone gets my message in the bottle, yeah. Message in the bottle, yeah. A year has passed since I wrote my note. I should have known this right from the start. Only hope can keep me together. Love can mend your life, but love can break your heart. I'll send an SOS to the world. I'll send an SOS to the world. I hope that someone gets mine. I hope that someone gets mine. Woke up this morning, won't believe what I saw. 100 million bottles washed up on the shore. Seems I'm not alone at being alone. 100 million castaways looking for a home. I'll send an SOS to the world. I'll send an SOS to the world. I hope that someone gets mine. I hope that someone gets mine. I hope that someone gets my message in a bottle, yeah. 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 Sending out an SOS. 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 Sending out an SOS.
We'll see you again.
Thanks for joining us. We'll be back soon with another episode of Wine, Whiskey, and Song. In the meantime, please like the video and leave any comments you have. And of course, subscribe to our channel.